In the grand saga of World War II, we remember the Titans. Patton, with his ivory-handled revolvers and fiery speeches. MacArthur, the enigmatic genius of the Pacific. Eisenhower, the supreme commander who held the fate of Europe in his hands. But what about the quiet general, the one who commanded the largest American army ever assembled, who led the first army from the beaches of Normandy all the way to the heart of Germany, and who, unlike nearly every other top commander, started his career at the very bottom? This is the story of Courtney Hicks Hodges, the soldier's soldier, the man history almost forgot. Our story begins not on the battlefield, but in a classroom. The year is 1906. A young, determined Courtney Hodges faces the daunting entrance exam for the United States Military Academy at West Point. This was the dream, the established path for any aspiring officer. But for Hodges, one subject stood in his way. Mathematics. He failed. For most, this would have been the end of the road. A rejection from West Point was a clear signal that a high-ranking military career was out of reach. But Courtney Hodges was not. Most men, disappointed but not defeated. He made a choice that was almost unheard of for someone with his ambitions. If he couldn't enter the army as an officer, he would enter as a private. In 1906, he enlisted in the 17th Infantry, a man with no special background, no political connections, and now no West Point credential. He was just another face in the ranks, a buck private at the bottom of a very steep pyramid. This was a world away from the hallowed halls of the academy. Life as an enlisted man was tough. The work was grueling, and the path to promotion was a slow, arduous crawl. But it was here, in the mud and the daily grind, that Hodges began to build the foundation of his legendary career. He learned the army from the ground up. He understood the life of the common soldier, their struggles, their fears, their needs, because he lived it. He cleaned rifles, stood guard duty, and marched until his feet bled. This experience forged in him a profound connection with the men he would one day lead, an empathy that other generals who had only known the officer's world could never truly grasp. Hodges was a quiet professional. He didn't make a lot of noise. He just did the work, and he did it better than anyone else. His superiors quickly noticed his intelligence, his discipline, and his unwavering dedication. He wasn't just going through the motions. He was mastering the craft of soldiering. Slowly but surely, through sheer competence and relentless effort, he began to climb. Within a year, he had made corporal. 10. Sergeant. Each promotion was earned, not through privilege, but through merit. He pored over military manuals, studied tactics, and proved his worth in every task assigned to him. He was proving that the army was more than just a place for the well-connected. It was a place where grit and ability could still pave a path to the top. Then, in 1909, an opportunity arose. After 3 years of exemplary service as an enlisted man, Hodges was given the chance to take the officer's commissioning exam. This was his second shot at the dream. He passed. Courtney Hicks Hodges, the West Point reject, the former private, was now a second lieutenant in the United States Army. This journey was extraordinary. It was a path that virtually no American general of his era had ever taken. The Officer Corps was a tight-knit club, dominated by West Point graduates. Hodges was an outsider who had forced his way in through the back door. He had seen both sides of the military divide, and this unique perspective would become his greatest strength. As a junior officer, he continued to serve with quiet distinction. He was sent to the Philippines, a common posting for the pre-war army, where he honed his skills in leadership and logistics. He wasn't flamboyant, like Patton, or a showman like MacArthur. He was methodical. His men respected him not because of his rank, but because he was competent and fair. He understood their world because he had once been a part of it. He knew the importance of good food, dry socks, and clear orders. These were the small but vital details that could make the difference between success and failure, between life and death. By 1914, as the storm clouds of war gathered over Europe, Hodges was a seasoned officer. He had spent years in the relative quiet of the peacetime army, preparing for a conflict that many hoped would never come. When the United States finally entered World War I in 1917, Hodges was ready. He was promoted to captain and then to major, and was assigned to the 6th Infantry Regiment, part of the 5th Division. He was about to be tested in the crucible of combat. The long years of training, the slow climb from private to major, had all been leading to this moment. He would cross the Atlantic to the Western Front, where he would command men in the brutal trench warfare of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. It was here that Courtney Hodges would truly prove his mettle, not just as a leader, but as a hero. In the heat of battle, he would earn the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor, for extraordinary heroism in action. The private who failed math was now a decorated war hero, leading his men with courage and skill across the shell-scarred fields of France. His improbable journey was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The quiet soldier was on his way to becoming a great general. Imagine this. The smoke clears, the guns fall silent, and a young officer stands on the scarred battlefields of France. The year is 1918. For Courtney Hodges, the Great War wasn't just an end. It was a brutal, unforgettable beginning. This was his classroom. The trenches were his textbooks, and the lessons were etched in mud and sacrifice. He saw courage in the face of chaos and endurance when everything screamed to give up. This wasn't something you could learn from a manual. It was a baptism by fire, and it forged the man who would one day lead one of America's largest armies. The war was over, but for Hodges, the real work had just begun. The roaring 20s and the lean 30s were his peacetime decades, but he never truly left the mindset of a soldier. While many officers were content with the quiet life of garrison duty, Hodges was relentlessly sharpening his skills. He wasn't a flashy intellectual or a charming politician in uniform. He was a quiet professional, a man who preferred the company of enlisted soldiers to the officers' club. He walked the motor pools, he inspected the supply lines, and most importantly, he listened. He understood that an army doesn't march on grand strategies alone. It marches on its stomach, on well-maintained engines, and on the morale of its youngest private. This period was his masterclass in the unglamorous, absolutely essential art of logistics. Hodges dove deep into the nuts and bolts of moving and supplying massive groups of men and machines. Think about it. Getting thousands of soldiers, tons of ammunition, food, fuel, and medical supplies to the right place at the right time, under pressure. It's a colossal puzzle, and one mistake can mean disaster. Hodges didn't just study it. He lived it. He learned how a broken-down truck in the rear could cost lives on the front line. He mastered the intricate dance of supply and demand that keeps an army alive and fighting. This wasn't theoretical knowledge. It was practical, hands-on expertise, earned through countless hours of planning, inspecting, and problem-solving. He became a master of the machinery of war, the gears that turned behind the front lines, invisible to most, but critical to all. At the same time, he was honing his skills in field command. Hodges was given a series of assignments that put him directly in charge of troops. He wasn't a distant figure, shouting orders from a map room. He was out in the field, in the dust and the rain, right alongside his men. He learned the rhythm of command, how to communicate orders clearly and concisely, how to read a landscape, and how to anticipate the enemy's moves. He developed a reputation as a calm, steady leader. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't panic. His presence alone was a source of confidence for the soldiers under his command. They knew that if Hodges was in charge, the plan was sound, and every detail had been considered. But perhaps his most profound education was in the psychology of the soldier. Having been one himself, an enlisted man who worked his way up, he never forgot what it was like to be on the receiving end of an order. He understood the fears, the hopes, and the motivations of the men in the ranks. He knew that trust wasn't given, it was earned. He earned it by being fair, by looking out for their welfare, and by demonstrating his own competence and courage. He learned that soldiers will follow a leader into hell and back, not because of the rank on his collar, but because they believe in him as a person. They need to know that their leader understands their sacrifice and that he won't waste their lives. This deep, empathetic understanding of the human element of warfare would become his greatest asset. He wasn't just managing troops, he was leading men. While others at the prestigious Command and General Staff School were debating abstract theories of war, Hodges was focused on the practical application. He was a pragmatist, not a theorist. He would listen to the grand lectures on military doctrine, but his mind was always translating them into real-world scenarios. How does this apply to a muddy road in winter? How do you explain this complex maneuver to a sergeant who's been awake for 48 hours? His classmates might have seen him as quiet, perhaps even unremarkable. They didn't see the gears turning, the quiet intensity of a man who was preparing for a reality they could only imagine. He was absorbing everything, filtering it through his own hard-won experience, and building a mental toolkit for a war he knew was coming. By the late 1930s, the world was holding its breath. The shadows of conflict were stretching across Europe and Asia once again. While many were still hoping for peace, Hodges was preparing for war. The 2 decades since World War I had not been a break for him. They had been a relentless, focused period of self-improvement and study. He had transformed himself from a brave infantry officer into a complete commander. He had mastered the logistics that fuel an army, the field command that directs it, and the human leadership that inspires it. He was a soldier's soldier, respected from the lowest private to the highest general. He wasn't a product of West Point's elite circles. He was a product of the foxhole, the motor pool, and the training field. When the storm finally broke, and the world plunged back into the darkness of World War II, Courtney Hodges was ready, not as a theorist with a head full of untested ideas, but as a seasoned, practical, and deeply experienced leader. He was the quiet professional, the man who had spent 20 years learning to lead, not for glory or for fame, but because he knew that one day the lives of thousands of American soldiers would depend on it. His apprenticeship was over. His moment was about to arrive. The lessons learned in the mud of France and perfected in the peacetime that followed would soon be put to the ultimate test. June 6th, 1944. Dawn breaks over the choppy waters of the English Channel. For months, the world has held its breath. Now, the largest amphibious invasion in history is underway. This is D-Day. At the heart of this immense operation, commanding the U.S. First Army, is a man whose name might not be as famous as Patton or Montgomery, but whose impact was just as profound. General Courtney Hodges. Hodges' First Army was the spearhead, the very tip of the Allied lance, aimed at Fortress Europe. Their mission was to storm the beaches codenamed Utah and Omaha. While Utah Beach was secured with relatively light casualties, Omaha was a different story entirely. It was a meat grinder. The initial waves of American soldiers were pinned down by a torrent of German machine gun fire, mortars, and artillery. The beach, soon to be known as Bloody Omaha, was a scene of chaos, courage, and unimaginable sacrifice. From his command post aboard the cruiser USS Augusta, Hodges received a storm of grim reports. The situation on Omaha was dire, bordering on catastrophic. Communications were spotty, units were shattered, and the carefully laid plans were dissolving in the blood-red surf. Some commanders were even considering abandoning the landing and diverting the follow-on forces elsewhere. The weight of tens of thousands of lives, and potentially the entire invasion, rested on the decisions made in the next few hours. This is where the character of Courtney Hodges truly shines through. He was not a man given to grand theatrical gestures or fiery speeches. His defining trait was an almost unnerving calm, a quiet confidence that steadied everyone around him. While others might have panicked, Hodges listened intently to the fragmented reports, his mind methodically piecing together the chaotic puzzle on the beach. He understood a fundamental truth of combat. The initial plan rarely survives contact with the enemy. What matters is adaptability, resolve, and the will to push forward. Instead of ordering a retreat, Hodges made a critical decision. He trusted his men on the ground. He believed in the junior officers and NCOs who were, at that very moment, taking the initiative, rallying small groups of soldiers, and finding weaknesses in the German defenses. He reinforced their efforts, directing naval gunfire to suppress key enemy strongpoints, and ordering engineers to blast open paths through the beach obstacles, even under withering fire. He kept the flow of reinforcements coming, gambling that sheer American grit and determination would eventually turn the tide. His gamble paid off. Small breakthroughs began to multiply. Soldiers, inspired by leaders like Brigadier General Norman Cota, started climbing the bluffs, slowly, painstakingly. The Americans clawed their way off the beach. Chaos was beginning to morph into progress. Be nightfall against all odds. A fragile but vital beachhead had been established on Omaha. The cost was staggering, but the foothold in France was secure. But for Hodges, command wasn't about directing battles from a distant, sanitized map room. His philosophy was rooted in presence. As soon as it was feasible, he moved his headquarters ashore, establishing it in a simple, muddy field, much closer to the front lines than many other senior generals would have dared. He believed that to truly command, you had to be there. You had to see what your soldiers were seeing, feel the same ground shake beneath your feet, and breathe the same air, thick with the smell of cordite and fear. This wasn't for show. It was fundamental to his leadership. He would regularly visit the front, often with little fanfare, his tall, lanky frame moving among the foxholes and hedgerows. He wasn't there to give grand speeches. He was there to observe, to listen, and to understand. He spoke with exhausted GS, asking simple, direct questions about their ammunition, their food, and the enemy they were facing. He wanted to know the reality of the fight, not the filtered version from staff reports. His hands-on approach earned him the quiet respect of his men. They saw a general who wasn't afraid to get his boots dirty, who shared their risks. They called him the GI's general, not because he was folksy or paternal, but because he seemed to understand their world. He managed his massive army, not like a chess master moving pieces, but like a master craftsman, feeling the grain of the wood, knowing its strengths and weaknesses intimately. The battle for Normandy was far from over. Ahead lay the brutal, close quarters, fighting in the hedgerow country. A nightmare landscape of thick earthen walls and hidden German defenders that would test the First Army to its limits. But the foundation had been laid on D-Day, secured by the bravery of thousands and guided by the steady, unflinching hand of Courtney Hicks. His leadership on that fateful day was not about seeking glory or making headlines. It was about shouldering an immense burden with quiet competence, transforming a near disaster into a hard-won victory, and proving that sometimes the most effective leadership is the one that is seen and felt, not just heard. History often remembers the generals who gave grand speeches, the ones who cultivated a larger-than-life persona. We think of Patton's fiery addresses or MacArthur's iconic poses, but leadership isn't always about the spotlight. Sometimes the most profound leadership is quiet, steady, and present. Today, we're diving into the story of a general you might not know as well, but whose impact was immeasurable. General Courtney Hicks and his philosophy of presence leadership. The summer of 1944. The world holds its breath. The Normandy landings have succeeded, but the fight for France is far from over. Allied forces are bogged down in the treacherous Bocage country, a nightmarish labyrinth of thick hedgerows, sunken lanes, and determined German defenders. For the soldiers of the U.S. First Army, every inch of ground is paid for in blood, sweat, and fear. Progress is agonizingly slow, and morale is starting to fray. In the midst of this brutal stalemate, a new commander takes the helm of the First Army. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges. He inherits a command at a critical, precarious moment. The pressure from above is immense. Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower and General Bradley are desperate for a breakthrough. The plan, Operation Cobra, is audacious and risky. It is a massive offensive designed to punch through the German lines and finally break out of the Normandy pocket. Everything hinges on its success. Now, if you were to picture a general in this high-stakes situation, you might imagine someone orchestrating the battle from a lavish, distant headquarters, surrounded by maps and aides, a figure of remote authority. That was not Courtney Hicks. He was the antithesis of the grandstanding general. His headquarters wasn't a chateau miles behind the lines. It was often a simple command truck, constantly on the move, always pushing closer to the fighting. He believed you couldn't command a battle you couldn't see. You couldn't lead men whose reality you didn't understand. This was the core of his philosophy: leadership by presence. While other generals might summon subordinates for briefings, Hodges went to them. He would appear, often unannounced, at division, regiment, and even battalion command posts. He wasn't there to intimidate or to micromanage. He was there to listen, to observe, to understand the ground truth. He'd walk the terrain, peer through binoculars at the German positions, and talk to the officers who were directly engaged with the enemy. Imagine being a young captain, exhausted, covered in grime, responsible for the lives of 200 men in a deadly maze of hedgerows. Suddenly, the armored commander himself, a 3-star general, is standing beside you, not barking orders, but asking quiet, intelligent questions. What are you seeing over there? What do your men need? What's the mud like in that next field? This wasn't just a courtesy call. It was a masterclass in effective leadership. Hodges was gathering real-time, unfiltered information that you simply couldn't get from a typed report. He was feeling the pulse of his army. His presence had a profound, twofold effect. First, it sharpened his own When General Bradley would call, anxious for updates, Hodges could provide an assessment based not on second-hand information, but on what he had seen with his own eyes just hours before. He understood the challenges his men faced because he had stood on the very ground they were fighting for. This allowed him to issue orders that were realistic, practical, and informed. He knew when to push and when to hold back, not based on a map, but on the tangible reality of the front line. Second, and perhaps more importantly, was the effect it had on the troops. Soldiers are perceptive. They know when a leader is genuinely invested in their welfare and when they are just a cog in a machine. They saw Hodges. They saw him sharing their risks. He wasn't tucked away in safety. His command post was frequently targeted by German artillery. He would move quietly among the units, a tall, unassuming figure, his face etched with a quiet seriousness. He didn't need to shout to command respect. His presence was enough. There's a famous story from this period that perfectly encapsulates his style. During one particularly intense phase of the fighting, Hodges was visiting a forward command post when it came under a heavy German artillery barrage. Shells screamed overhead, exploding nearby, shaking the very ground. Staff officers, understandably, dove for cover. But Hodges just stood there, calmly observing the direction of the incoming fire, seemingly unperturbed. He wasn't being reckless. He was demonstrating a quiet, unsacable courage. The message this sent down the chain of command was powerful. If the army commander can stand firm under fire, so can we. His calmness was contagious. It wasn't the theatrical bravado of a Patton. It was a deep internal fortitude that inspired confidence. Soldiers followed him not because he shouted the loudest, but because he stood beside them when the shells fell. They knew he was in it with them. This built a foundation of trust that is the bedrock of any successful military unit. His men knew that their commander understood their plight and would not waste their lives on ill-conceived plans. This presence leadership was instrumental during Operation Cobra at the end of July 1944. The initial phases of the operation were chaotic. Friendly fire from a massive aerial bombardment caused significant casualties and confusion. A lesser commander might have panicked or pulled back. But Hodges, having been on the ground, understanding the situation intimately, kept his nerve. He made crucial adjustments. He pushed his divisions forward, and he trusted the commanders he had personally spoken with. His steady hand on the tiller guided the First Army through the initial chaos. And then the breakthrough came. The German line, battered and stretched thin, finally shattered. What followed was a stunning advance. The First Army poured through the Gaff, tanks and infantry racing across France. The hedgerow nightmare was over, and the race to Paris had begun. Courtney Hodges would never be a household name like some of his contemporaries. He avoided the press, disliked public ceremonies, and sought no personal glory. He was often described as the unknown general. But his legacy is written across the battlefields of France and Germany. It's a legacy of quiet competence, of unshakable calm, and of a leader who understood that true command comes not from the height of your rank, but from the depth of your presence. He proved that sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is simply show up, listen, and share the danger. August 1944. The Allies are storming through France, a tide of steel and fury pushing the Germans back toward the Rhine. At the head of the U.S. First Army is a man who seems to defy all the rules of military textbooks, General Courtney Hodges. To his men, he was a quiet, dependable leader, the kind of general you'd follow into the very jaws of hell. But to his superiors, men like Omar Bradley and even the Supreme Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Hodges was a source of constant, simmering frustration. You see, The military loves doctrine. It loves plans, neat lines on a map, and predictable outcomes. War is chaos, and doctrine is the attempt to impose order on that chaos. Generals are trained from their first day at West Point to follow these established principles. You secure your flanks. You maintain a continuous front. You don't overextend your supply lines. These aren't just suggestions. They are the gospel of modern warfare, written in the blood of past failures. But Courtney Hodges had a different gospel. His was the gospel of speed, opportunity, and relentless pressure. He saw the German army in France not as a solid, unbreakable wall, but as a crumbling dam with cracks appearing everywhere. While other commanders might pause to consolidate their gains, to regroup and resupply according to the book, Hodges would see a crack and immediately pour his entire army through it. His superiors would look at the situation map back at headquarters, and their blood pressure would spike. Hodges's units would be deep into enemy territory, their flanks exposed, their supply lines stretched thin like a rubber band about to snap. On paper, it was a disaster waiting to happen, Bradley would call, his voice tight with anxiety, demanding to know why Hodges was breaking protocol. Eisenhower would send worried dispatches, cautioning against reckless advances. They saw a commander gambling with the lives of his men, violating the fundamental rules of engagement. But down on the ground, a different picture was emerging. Hodges's risky maneuvers did the exact opposite. By punching deep and fast, he kept the enemy off balance. German commanders, expecting a methodical Allied advance, were suddenly faced with American tanks in their rear areas. They had to abandon fortified positions not because they were defeated in a set-piece battle, but because they were about to be surrounded. His columns would bypass strong points, leaving them to be mopped up later, and race for the next river crossing, the next vital crossroads. He was creating chaos within the enemy's ranks, turning their own doctrine against them. This was the essence of the friction. The men at the top, like Bradley and Ike, were playing a grand strategic chess game, focused on the entire European theater. They had to worry about logistics for millions of men, political considerations, and the coordination of multiple army groups. From their perspective, Hodges's army was a single, vital piece on this massive board, and he was moving it in a way that seemed to jeopardize the entire game, take a risk. Hodges, on the other hand, was a fighter. He was on the front lines, figuratively and sometimes literally. He could feel the pulse of the battle. He knew his divisions, he trusted his corps' commanders, and he had an intuitive sense for the enemy's breaking point. He saw opportunity. When his scouts reported an undefended bridge, he didn't send a request up the chain of command and wait for approval. He ordered the nearest division to seize it. Now, he would apologize to Bradley later, but he would have the bridge, and the results were simply undeniable. As the summer of 1944 drew to a close, the evidence was stark. The First Army's advance across France was breathtaking. It was a lightning campaign that outpaced even the most optimistic predictions made during the planning for D-Day. Cities and towns were being liberated weeks ahead of schedule. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were being captured, not in grand encirclements planned by staff officers, but in the confused, chaotic retreat that Hodges's relentless pressure had caused. You can almost imagine the conversations at SHAEF headquarters. An aide would rush in with the latest report. "Sir, Hodges has crossed the Seine." And Eisenhower might reply, "He did what?" But his flank is completely in the air. The criticism was valid. The risks were real, but the results were spectacular. Every mile that Hodges advanced was another mile the Germans couldn't defend. Every German unit he shattered was a unit that could be sent to phase Patton's Third Army to the south, or Montgomery's 21st Army Group to the north. This period perfectly captures the paradox of Courtney Hodges. He wasn't a charismatic showman like Patton. He didn't give fiery speeches or design his own uniforms. He was the soldier's general, quiet and unassuming. But beneath that calm exterior was a killer instinct, a willingness to roll the dice when he sensed the enemy was faltering. His superiors might have found him frustrating, a student who refused to follow the lesson plan, but you can't argue with success. And as the First Army raced toward the German border, leaving a trail of defeated enemy divisions in its wake, Courtney Hodges's results weren't just speaking louder than the criticism, they were drowning it out completely. His audacious, rule-breaking advance was a critical factor in the swift liberation of France. a stunning achievement that changed the entire timeline of the war in the West. Picture this: August 25th, 1944. The air in Paris, heavy with 4 years of occupation, is suddenly electric. The tricolor flies from the Eiffel Tower. Church bells ring out across the city, and crowds pour into the streets, singing, crying, and embracing soldiers' parties is free. This monumental victory, the liberation of one of the world's most beloved cities, was a pivotal moment in World War II. It was a symbol of hope, a sign that the tide had irrevocably turned against Nazi Germany. And at the heart of this military operation was the U.S. First Army, commanded by a man you might not have heard of, General Courtney Hicks. When we think of the great generals of World War II, names like Patton, Eisenhower, or Montgomery often come to mind. They were charismatic, larger-than-life figures who dominated headlines and captured the public imagination. But history is full of quiet giants, leaders whose impact far outweighs their fame. General Hodges was one of them. He was the complete opposite of his flamboyant contemporary, George S. Patton. Where Patton was loud, Hodges was reserved. Where Patton sought the spotlight, Hodges actively shunned it. He was known as the quiet man of the war, a methodical, unassuming leader who focused purely on the mission and the welfare of his men. His colleagues described him as calm, professional, and utterly dependable. General Omar Bradley, his superior, once said that if he had to go to sleep knowing a major battle was underway, he would sleep soundest if Hodges was in command. That was the kind of trust he inspired. Hodges' journey to this moment in Paris was a testament to his grit and determination. He had an unusual career path for a 4-star general. He actually failed a geometry exam at West Point and had to drop out after his first year. But instead of giving up on his military ambitions, he enlisted in the Army as a private in 1906. Over the next 3 decades, he worked his way up through the ranks, proving his capabilities every step of the way. He earned his commission from the enlisted ranks, a rare and respected achievement. This experience gave him a unique perspective. He understood the life of an ordinary soldier because he had been one. So, on that historic day in August 1944, as the world's attention was fixed on Paris, where was General Hodges? He wasn't posing for photographs at the Arc de Triomphe or giving grand speeches. He wasn't at the center of the jubilant ceremonies. Instead, he did something that perfectly captured his character. A walk. Quietly, without any fanfare, General Hodges strolled through the liberated streets of Paris. He moved through the crowds, an anonymous figure amidst the celebration he had orchestrated. He wasn't looking for glory or recognition. He was observing. He was watching his soldiers, the men of the First Army, interact with the Parisian civilians they had just freed. Imagine what he saw. Soldiers weary from combat, sharing their precious rations, chocolate bars, cigarettes, and ration cans with families who had known hunger for years. He saw children perched on the shoulders of Jiazhu waving tiny flags. He saw tearful reunions, the raw, unfiltered emotion of a city reborn. He saw laughter and heard the sounds of freedom echoing off the old stone buildings. For Hodges, this was the true victory. It wasn't the strategic lines on a map or the political significance of capturing a capital. It was the human connection. It was the restoration of dignity, the simple acts of kindness between his soldiers and the people they had come to help. This was the reason they fought. In that moment, watching a GI share a piece of bread with a child, Hodges saw the validation of all the hardship, all the sacrifice. His leadership style was built on this foundation of quiet competence and deep humanity. He preferred to lead from a forward command post, staying close to the action and the men he was leading. He wasn't a chateau general, commanding from a safe distance. This approach earned him the immense respect of his troops. They knew he understood their struggles and that he wouldn't waste their lives. While other generals were making headlines, Hodges and the First Army were consistently getting the job done. They were the first to cross the Rhine River into Germany at Remagen, a daring and crucial breakthrough. They fought through some of the most brutal campaigns of the war, including the Battle of the Bulge and the grueling Hirschgan Forest campaign. Through it all, Hodges remained the steady, unflappable commander, focused on achieving the objective while minimizing casualties. His legacy is not one of fiery speeches or dramatic photographs, but of solid, dependable leadership that saved countless lives and played a crucial role in winning the war in Europe. He represents a different kind of hero, the kind that doesn't need applause. The kind whose satisfaction comes from a job well done and from witnessing the positive impact of their actions on ordinary people. The story of General Hodges in Paris is a powerful reminder that true leadership is unbound the spotlight. It's about service, humility, and a deep-seated concern for humanity. As the world celebrated the grand political victory, Hodges found his reward in the small, human moments on the streets of Paris. He understood that the real measure of success wasn't in the fall of a flag, but in the rise of the human spirit. It's a lesson that transcends the battlefield. In any field, in any walk of life, the most profound impact often comes not from the loudest voice, but from the steadiest hand and the quietest heart. The liberation of Paris was a victory for the history books, but for the quiet general who made it happen, the real victory was witnessing humanity reclaim its hope, one shared smile and one piece of chocolate at a time. September 1944. The Allied advance across France had been breathtaking, a lightning-fast sprint from the Normandy beaches to the very doorstep of Germany. But now, looming before them was a formidable obstacle, a barrier of steel and concrete that snaked for nearly 400 miles along Germany's western frontier. This was the Siegfried Line, or, as the Germans called it, the West Wall. To the world, it was sold as an impregnable fortress, a dragon's teeth-lined testament to German engineering and resolve. The propaganda machine had worked overtime, painting a picture of an unbreakable wall that would bleed the Allies white. And for the soldiers of the U.S. First Army, staring at those pillbox bunkers and anti-tank obstacles, the legend felt terrifyingly real. Leading this army was a man who was the complete opposite of the bombastic, larger-than-life generals often celebrated in the press. Lieutenant General Courtney Hicks was quiet, methodical, and unassuming. He wasn't a man for grand speeches or flashy gestures. His uniform was always neat, his demeanor calm, almost academic. So mistook his quiet nature for a lack of aggression, a fatal flaw in a commander. They couldn't have been more wrong. Hodges' mind was a weapon, and his leadership wasn't about shouting orders. It was about surgical precision, relentless efficiency, and a ruthless clarity of purpose. While others saw an impenetrable wall, Hodges saw a complex problem to be dissected and solved, piece by agonizing piece. The first major test came at the city of Aachen. This wasn't just any German city. It was the ancient Capitala Charlemagne, a place steeped in German history and national pride. Hitler himself had declared it must be defended to the last man. Encircling Aachen was a double ring of Siegfried Line fortifications, making it the linchpin of the entire defensive system in that sector. Taking it would be a brutal, bloody affair. Hodges knew this. He wasn't going to throw his men away in a glorious but futile frontal assault. Instead, he devised a plan that was pure Hodges, a methodical, two-pronged envelopment. The plan was for the 30th Infantry Division to attack from the north, and the 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red One, to drive up from the south. Their goal was to meet, to choke the city off, trapping its defenders. This was easier said than done. The terrain was a nightmare. The German defenders were well entrenched, determined, and fighting on their home soil. The battle for Aachen would become a brutal slog, fought yard by yard, bunker by bunker. The weather turned sour, with constant rain and chilling winds, turning the fields into a muddy quagmire that bogged down tanks and exhausted the infantry. This is where Hodges' unique brand of leadership shone through. He wasn't in a distant chateau, moving pins on a map. He was constantly near the front, observing, analyzing, and adapting. His real genius lay in the coordination of his forces. He orchestrated a symphony of destruction, where every instrument played its part in perfect harmony. The infantry would probe and pin down the German positions. Then, Hodges would call in the artillery. Not just a few shells, but a terrifying, overwhelming barrage. He used what was known as time-on-target bombardments, where multiple artillery batteries would fire at different times, all precisely calculated so that their shells would land on the same target at the exact same moment. For the German soldiers huddled in their bunkers, It was a cataclysmic, soul-shattering experience. While the earth was still shaking from the artillery, the tanks would move in. Sherman tanks, often outgunned by their German counterparts, were used creatively. Some were fitted with dozer blades to fill in anti-tank ditches. Others, the fearsome Zippo Shermans, were equipped with flamethrowers, spewing liquid fire into the narrow firing slits of the concrete pillars. It was a terrifyingly effective, if gruesome, tactic. And right behind the tanks came the infantry again, with engineers using satchel charges and pole charges to blast open the fortified positions one by one. Hodges saw his combined arms doctrine not as a rigid formula, but as a flexible toolbox. He gave his subordinate commanders the resources they needed, and the freedom to use them as they saw fit to solve the problems in front of them. The fighting was savage. One of the key objectives was a place called Crucifix Hill. It was a barren, exposed piece of high ground, dominated by a large concrete bunker. The position had to be taken. After a massive artillery preparation, men from the 1st Infantry Division charged up the slope. They faced a storm of machine gun and mortar fire. Casualties were heavy, but they didn't stop. They reached the bunker, climbed on top of it, and dropped explosives down its ventilation shafts. The battle for one hill, one bunker, was a microcosm of the entire fight for the Siegfried Line. It was a testament to the courage of the American GI and the cold, calculated strategy of their commander. Slowly but surely, the two arms of Hodges' pincer closed around Ocon. By mid-October, the city was surrounded. The German commander refused to surrender, obeying Hitler's fanatical order. So, Hodges unleashed the final phase of his plan. U.S. forces began to fight their way into the city itself. This was urban warfare at its most brutal. Every street, every house, every pile of rubble could hide a sniper or a machine gun nest. Tanks dueled with anti-tank guns at point-blank range in the narrow streets. The fighting was house to house, room to room. Finally, after weeks of relentless pressure, the German garrison surrendered on October 21st. Aachen became the first German city to fall to the Allies. The fall of Aachen was a massive psychological and strategic victory. It proved that the Siegfried Line, the great, mythical West Wall, could be broken. It wasn't done with a single, dramatic cavalry charge, but with a steady, grinding pressure that was Courtney Hodges' trademark. He had shown that creative coordination, a deep understanding of combined arms, and a leader's unwavering nerve could overcome even the most formidable defenses. Hodges' success wasn't just about tactics. It was about his relationship with his men. He trusted them. He didn't micromanage. He provided the strategy, the resources, and the support. And then he trusted his soldiers, NCOs and officers to get the job done. This trust fostered initiative and adaptability on the battlefield, qualities that were essential in the chaotic fighting for the Siegfried Line. His quiet confidence instilled a sense of purpose in his troops. They knew their commander had a plan, a logical and sound plan, and that their sacrifices were not being wasted. As the fall of 1944 drew on, the First Army continued its grueling advance, punching more holes in the Siegfried Line through the Hirschgarten Forest battle that would become one of the most brutal of the entire war. But the blueprint for success had been established at Aachen. Courtney Hodges had faced Germany's impregnable wall and, through surgical, efficient, and ruthless application of military power, he had broken it open. He proved that in the crucible of war, it is not always the loudest voice that wins the day, but often the clearest mind. His legacy is not one of dramatic flair, but of quiet competence and deadly effectiveness. The silent general who systematically tore down a fortress and opened the gate to the heart of Germany. December 1944. The forests of the Ardennes in Belgium are blanketed in a thick, heavy snow. A silence hangs over the front lines. A deceptive calm that many Allied soldiers mistook for the quiet winding down of a war they believed was already won. Christmas was just around the corner, and the talk was of being home soon. But deep within the German lines, something massive was stirring. There, Wehrmacht, battered but not yet broken, was gathering for one last, monumental gamble. This was the prelude to the Battle of the Bulge, a desperate, violent eruption that would become the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States in World War II. In the Crosshairs of this surprise German offensive was the American First Army, commanded by General Courtney Hodges. Hodges was a quiet, unassuming leader, often overshadowed by the more flamboyant personalities like Patton or Montgomery. He was known as a soldier's soldier, methodical, steady, and professional. But his command was stretched thin, holding a supposedly quiet sector of the front. The soldiers here were a mix of exhausted veterans who had fought their way from Normandy and Green, inexperienced troops seeing their first taste of winter warfare. They were tired, they were cold, and they were about to be hit by a tidal wave. On the morning of December 16th, the quiet was shattered. Over 250,000 German soldiers, backed by nearly 1,000 tanks and heavy assault guns, crashed through the thinly held American lines. The German plan, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine, was audacious. 3 powerful armies would punch through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and then swing north to capture the vital port of Antwerp. This would sever the Allied supply lines and trap for entire armies, forcing the Western Allies to sue for a separate peace. It was Hitler's final, desperate roll of the dice. The initial assault was a maelstrom of shock and confusion. Thick fog and low clouds grounded the powerful Allied air forces, leaving the soldiers on the ground to fend for themselves. German artillery rained down, cutting communication lines and isolating units. Infiltrators dressed in American uniforms, led by the infamous Otto Skorzeny, spread chaos behind the lines, changing road signs, misdirecting traffic, and creating an atmosphere of intense paranoia. American geese, suddenly fighting for their lives, had to ask each other questions only a true American would know, like who's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? Or what's the capital of Illinois? The German spearheads, particularly the elite SS Panzer divisions, drove deep into the American positions. Entire regiments were overrun, surrounded, and forced to surrender. The news reaching Allied Supreme Headquarters was fragmented and alarming. A massive bulge was indeed forming in the front line, threatening to break it completely. The pressure on General Hodges and his First Army was immense. Many, including some on the Allied High Command, feared he would crack under the strain. His forces were taking the full force of the German onslaught, and his headquarters in the town of Spa, Belgium, was directly in the path of the advancing panzers. This was the ultimate test of leadership. While others might have panicked or ordered a full-scale retreat, Hodges remained remarkably calm. He was the eye of the storm. As reports of chaos flooded his command post, he meticulously analyzed the maps, identified key defensive positions, and began the critical process of stabilizing the front. He refused to be rattled, even as German shells began to fall near his own headquarters. Instead of pulling back, he ordered his staff to grab their rifles and prepare to defend the building. His coolness under fire was contagious. It sent a clear message to his beleaguered troops. We are not breaking. Hodges' strategy was one of calculated defense and containment. He recognized that the German advance was powerful, but also reckless. They were burning through fuel and ammunition at an unsustainable rate. His job was to slow them down, to bleed team, and to hold key crossroads and river crossings at all costs. This led to legendary stands at places like St. Vith, and, most famously, at Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division rushed in to plug the gap, found themselves completely surrounded. When the German commander demanded their surrender, the American acting commander, General Anthony McAuliffe, gave a legendary one-word reply. Nuts. This defiance became the symbol of the American resistance. All across the Ardennes, small units, cut off and outnumbered, fought with incredible tenacity. They blew bridges, laid minefields, and ambushed German columns in the dense, snow-covered forests. Every hour of delay was another hour the Germans couldn't reach their objectives, another hour for Allied reinforcements to pour into the sector. Hodges masterfully orchestrated this defense, shifting his reserves, establishing new defensive lines, and ensuring his battered army did not collapse into a rout. Meanwhile, General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army to the south, was ordered to turn his entire army 90 degrees and attack the southern flank of the German Bulge. It was an incredible logistical feat, one that only Patton could pull off with such speed and aggression. While Patton prepared his famous relief effort toward Bastogne, Hodges was preparing his own counterpunch from the north. He was regrouping his forces, pulling together the scattered remnants of shattered divisions and feeding in fresh troops. He was transforming a desperate defense into the foundation for a powerful counterattack. By Christmas Day, the tide began to turn. The weather finally broke. The skies cleared, and the Jabos, the Allied fighter bombers, were unleashed. They swarmed over the Ardennes, wreaking havoc on the German columns now stalled on the roads, out of fuel and exposed. It was a turkey shoot. The German logistical nightmare had come true. Their armored spearheads were stranded, easy targets for both air power and American artillery. The great German gamble had failed. They had punched a deep bulge into the Allied line, but they had not broken it. Now it was Hodges' turn. With the German offensive grinding to a halt, he and Patton began to squeeze the bulge from both the north and the south. In the bitter, cold, and deep snow of January, the First Army launched its counterattack. It was a brutal, grinding fight. The Germans, though their offensive was spent, fought back desperately from well-prepared defensive positions. The fighting was often at close quarters, in frozen woods and snow-filled foxholes. Frostbite and trench-foot became as big an enemy as the Germans. Yet, Hodges' men pushed forward relentlessly. By the end of January 1945, the battle was over. The Bulge was eliminated, and the front lines were restored to where they had been in early December. But the cost was staggering. The Battle of the Bulge resulted in over 80,000 American casualties, making it the costliest battle in U.S. history. The Germans suffered even more, losing over 100,000 men in critically irreplaceable tanks, aircraft, and veteran troops. The Wehrmacht's armored reserve was shattered, and its ability to launch any major offensive on the Western Front was gone forever. In the aftermath, Patton's dramatic relief of Bastogne captured the public imagination. But military historians recognize the vital, if less glamorous, role played by Courtney Hicks. When faced with a surprise attack that could have shattered the Allied front, he did not waver. He held the line, stabilized the front, and laid the groundwork for the decisive counter. He absorbed the enemy's best punch, and then, with quiet competence, hit back and broke them. The soldier had faced his greatest test in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and had emerged victorious, paving the way for the final push into the heart of Germany. The winter of 1945 was brutal. On the surface, the Allied advance into Germany looked like a well-oiled machine, a relentless push towards victory. But beneath the headlines and the triumphant newsreels, a different kind of war was being waged not against the enemy, but within the Allied High Command itself. At the heart of this conflict was one of America's most effective, yet controversial generals, Courtney Hicks. To understand the tension, you have to understand the man. Hodges was a soldier's soldier. He came up the hard way, starting as a private and earning his stars through grit, intelligence, and an uncanny ability to read a battlefield. He wasn't a West Point man, and he didn't play the political games that thrived in the rear echelons. His headquarters were always close to the front. His boots were often muddy, and his loyalty was to his men and the mission, not necessarily to the chain of command. This approach, which had made his First Army the backbone of the American effort in Europe, was now putting him on a collision course with the two most powerful American generals in the theater. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower and the commander of the 12th Army Group, Omar Bradley. Eisenhower, the master diplomat and coalition builder, saw Hodges as a loose cannon. From his supreme headquarters, Ike was trying to manage a massive, multinational force. He needed predictability. He needed his generals to stick to the grand strategic plan. But Hodges had a habit of exploiting opportunities as they arose on the ground, even if it meant deviating from the script. Eisenhower would look at his maps and see Hodges' First Army pushing ahead faster than planned, creating logistical headaches and exposing flanks. He privately fumed, calling Hodges tactics, reckless, and impulsive. He wanted a general who followed orders to the letter. What he had was a general who was winning, but on his own terms. Then there was Omar Bradley, Hodges' direct superior. On the surface, Bradley and Hodges were old friends. They had served together for decades, but war changes men and relationships. Bradley, known as the GI's general, had cultivated a public image of quiet competence. But he was also a meticulous planner who valued order and control above all else. They saw Hodges' independent streak not as initiative, but as Bradley would complain to his staff that Hodges was too independent, that he was running his own private war. He felt that Hodges often acted without clearing it with his headquarters first, presenting Bradley with a fait accompli, a situation that was already in motion and couldn't be easily reversed. This constant friction created a palpable sense of mistrust. While Bradley publicly praised the First Army's successes, privately he was growing increasingly frustrated, feeling that Hodges was undermining his authority. But from Hodges' perspective, his actions were not just justified, they were necessary. He believed that leadership wasn't about blind obedience to a plan drawn up miles away from the fighting. It was about adapting to the fluid, chaotic reality of the front line. He trusted the intelligence he got from his own patrols, more than the reports filtered up through layers of bureaucracy. When a junior officer told him a bridge was surprisingly intact or a German defensive line was weaker than expected, Hodges listened. He believed that the men facing the enemy fire knew the truth of the situation better than anyone sitting in a comfortable headquarters. This philosophy was put to the ultimate test during the critical push to the Rhine River. The Grand Allied plan called for a slow, methodical advance, a broad front strategy favored by Eisenhower and Bradley. But Hodges' scouts discovered something incredible. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was still standing. German defenders had tried to demolish it, but the charges had failed. This was a one-in-a-million opportunity. Waiting for permission from Bradley's or Eisenhower's headquarters would take hours, maybe even a day. By then, the Germans would surely have succeeded in blowing it up. Hodges didn't hesitate. He made the call on his own. "Get across," he ordered. "Get everything you can across that bridge." It was a massive gamble. He was sending his men into a potential trap over a single heavily damaged bridge, deep into enemy territory. He was completely ignoring the established operational plan. If it failed, his career would be over. He would be remembered as the reckless general who sacrificed his men for a foolish whim. For 24 agonizing hours, the fate of the battle and Hodges' reputation hung in the balance. Bradley was furious when he found out. Eisenhower was apoplectic. They saw it as the ultimate act of defiance. The plan was in tatters. But then, the reports started coming in. Not only had the First Army secured the bridge, but they had established a robust bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Rhine. Thousands of American soldiers and hundreds of vehicles were pouring into the heart of Germany. What was supposed to be an impenetrable barrier had been breached. The capture of the Remagen Bridge changed the entire complexion of the war in the West. It unhinged the German defenses and dramatically accelerated the Allied timetable. It saved countless lives by shortening the war. It was a stunning success, a result that no one else could have achieved because no one else would have dared to try. Suddenly, the criticism fell silent. Eisenhower, ever the pragmatist, had to concede the brilliance of the move, famously saying the bridge was worth its weight in gold. Bradley, though still privately irritated, had no choice but to support the breakout. Hodges was vindicated, but the tensions remained. His clash with the bureaucracy wasn't about ego or personal ambition. It was a fundamental disagreement about the nature of command. Eisenhower and Bradley saw the war from the top down, a grand chess match where generals were the pieces. Hodges saw it from the ground up, a brutal, messy fight where success depended on speed, initiative, and trusting the men on the front line. He understood that in the chaos of battle, rigid adherence to a plan could be a death sentence. True leadership, in his eyes, demanded the courage to listen to the truth from the ground, and the audacity to act on it, even if it meant ruffling the feathers of his superiors. His methods were unorthodox. They were disruptive, but they delivered victory when it mattered most. Thank you for watching. If you found this glimpse into the hidden conflicts of World War II interesting, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. We'll see you in the next one. Imagine this. It's March 1945. The war in Europe has been raging for nearly 6 years. For the Allies, every inch of ground has been hard-won, paid for in blood and sacrifice. Now, they stand at the very doorstep of Germany itself, facing the last great natural barrier, the mighty Rhine River. For centuries, the Rhine has been more than just water. It's a symbol of German strength, a line that invaders have struggled to cross. German propaganda has hammered this point home, calling the Rhine Germany's sacred, unbreachable guardian. Crossing it wouldn't just be a military victory. It would be a shattering blow to the German psyche. The Allied High Command has a plan, of course. Operation Plunder is in the works, a massive, meticulously coordinated assault involving airborne drops and amphibious crossings. It's scheduled for late March. But war, as they say, is the realm of uncertainty. And sometimes, history is made not by grand plans, but by a handful of determined soldiers and one very lucky break. Enter the U.S. First Army, commanded by the quiet, unassuming General Courtney Hodges. Hodges wasn't a showman like Patton or a charismatic figure like Montgomery. He was a professional, a methodical and relentless tactician often described as the soldier's soldier. He had led his men from the beaches of Normandy, through the hedgerows of France, and into the brutal slog of the Herdgone forest. His men trusted him implicitly. They knew that when Hodges gave an order, it was based on solid instinct and a deep understanding of the battlefield. As the First Army pushed towards the Rhine, their primary objective was to clear the western bank and link up with other Allied forces. Capturing a bridge was a dream, but one that seemed increasingly unlikely. The Germans were experts at demolition. Time and time again, as Allied troops approached, they would hear the deafening roar of explosives as another bridge collapsed into the river below. The Germans were determined to make the Allies pay for every foot of German soil. On March 7th, a small task force from the 9th Armored Division, part of Hodges' First Army, was making its way toward the small town of Riem. The unit was led by a young, 27-year-old lieutenant named Karl Tim. As they cautiously approached the high ground overlooking the town, they couldn't believe their eyes. There, spanning the Rhine, was the Ludendorff Bridge, still standing. It was a miracle. Smoke was rising from the bridge, indicating that demolition charges had been set. But for some reason, they hadn't fully detonated Wasset a trap. It was a huge risk. The Germans could blow the bridge at any second, sending anyone on it, plummeting into the icy waters below. But Timmerman and his men saw the opportunity of a lifetime. Word was flashed up the chain of command. When it reached General Hodges, his response was swift and decisive. He didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for permission from Supreme Command. His orders were simple and direct. Get across. Use everything you've got. This was classic Hodges. He saw a tactical opening and seized it with both hands. He understood the immense psychological and strategic value of what was happening. This wasn't just about getting a few tanks across the river. It was about breaking the will of the German army. Back at the bridge, it was a scene of controlled chaos. German machine gun and sniper fire raked the structure. Timmerman and his men charged forward, a small band of infantry running a gauntlet of death. Engineers scrambled onto the bridge, frantically cutting wires and removing demolition charges, some of which were still smoking. One massive charge did go off, shaking the entire structure and throwing debris into the air. But the bridge, incredibly, held. Sergeant Alexander Drobick was the first American soldier to set foot on the eastern bank of the Rhine. He was soon followed by others. Platoon by platoon, they secured a small bridgehead, fighting off desperate German counter. For the first time in the war, a U.S. Army unit stood on German soil east of the Rhine. The psychological barrier was broken. The news spread like wildfire. When it reached General Eisenhower at Supreme Headquarters, he was ecstatic. "Hot dog! Courtney!" he reportedly exclaimed over the phone to Hodges. "This is a bridge of gold." General Omar Bradley would later write that the capture of the bridge was worth its weight in gold. It completely disrupted German defensive plans, and likely shortened the war by weeks, if not months, saving countless lives on both sides. For the next 10 days, the Ludendorff Bridge became a lifeline. Under Hodges' direction, the First Army poured troops, tanks, and supplies across the Rhine. Engineers worked around the clock to reinforce the damaged structure and build pontoon bridges alongside it. The Germans threw everything they had at the bridge artillery, V-2 rockets, and even the world's first jet bombers in a frantic effort to destroy it. But it was too late. The bridgehead was too strong. The soldiers who followed Hodges across that bridge did so without a moment's hesitation. They trusted his instincts, as if they were their own. They had been with him through the worst fighting of the war, and they knew he wouldn't lead them astray. This was the culmination of that trust. The moment was a testament to the bond between a commander and his men, forged in the crucible of combat. On March 17th, after 10 days of relentless use and constant bombardment, the Ludendorff Bridge finally succumbed to its wounds and collapsed into the Rhine. But by then, its job was done. Tens of thousands of Allied soldiers were firmly established on the eastern bank. The gateway into the heart of Germany was wide open. The final offensive could begin. The capture of the bridge at Remagen remains one of the most audacious and pivotal moments of World War II. It was a combination of luck, incredible bravery from the soldiers on the ground, and the decisive, clear-headed leadership of a general who knew when to throw the plan book out the window. Courtney Hodges and his First Army didn't just cross a river. They crossed a psychological Rubicon, signaling to the world and, more importantly, to the German people that the end was near. It was a stunning achievement that cemented Hodges' place as one of the great, if unsung, commanders of the war in the final, triumphant days of World War II in Europe. As May 1945 dawned, the world's attention was captured by giants. Newspapers and radio broadcasts were filled with the thunderous names of Patton and Montgomery. Patton, the audacious, pearl-handled, pistol-wielding showman, and Montgomery, the meticulous, beret-clad British field marshal. They were the architects of victory, the faces of Allied might, their legends forged in the crucible of North Africa, Sicily, and the race across France. Yet, in the shadow of these towering figures stood another man, a quieter, less flamboyant general, whose contributions were just as monumental, if not more so. His name was Courtney Hicks Hodges. Hodges commanded the U.S. First Army, the largest single American field army in the nation's history. Think about that for a moment. At its peak, he was responsible for over 500,000 soldiers. His army was the first to cross the Rhine into Germany, the first to capture a major German city, Aachen, and the force that held the northern shoulder of the Bulge against the most ferocious German onslaught of the war. Under his command, the First Army never lost a major battle, not one. Despite this incredible record, Hodges remained a relative unknown to the American public. He was the silent victor. Why? The answer lies in the man himself. Courtney Hodges was the antithesis of the media savé, headline-grabbing generals of his time. He was born in Perry, Georgia, the son of a newspaper publisher, but he had no taste for the spotlight his father's profession thrived on. He was a professional soldier through and through, a man who believed actions spoke far louder than words. His journey began in a way that defined his character, when he failed a single math class at West Point, forcing him to drop out. He didn't give up. The very next year, he enlisted in the United States Army as a private. He was determined to earn his commission the hard way, and he did. This experience, rising from the lowest rank to the highest field command, gave Hodges a unique perspective. He understood the common soldier because he had been one. He knew the grit, the fear, and the quiet determination that filled the foxholes. He wasn't a general who commanded from a distant, comfortable chateau. He was known for his frontline leadership. Hodges was constantly visiting his troops, talking with them, observing the conditions firsthand. He wasn't there for a photo opportunity. He was there to understand, to lead, and to ensure his men had what they needed to survive and succeed. This quiet, hands-on approach earned him something far more valuable than fame: the unwavering loyalty and trust of his soldiers. De Kayadim. The soldiers general, they knew he cared not for personal glory, but for their welfare and the success of their mission. While other generals might be known for fiery speeches, Hodges was known for his calm, steady demeanor. In the chaos of battle, his unflappable presence was a source of strength for everyone, from his corps commanders down to the riflemen on the front line. His leadership style was brilliantly effective. Consider the Battle of the Bulge. When the German offensive erupted in the Ardennes, it was Hodges' First Army that bore the brunt of the initial, powerful assault, while Patton famously raced north to relieve Best, a feat that captured the world's imagination. It was Hodges' troops who heroically held the northern flank, preventing a catastrophic German breakthrough. They endured horrific conditions, outnumbered and outgunned in the initial days, but they did not break. Hodges' methodical repositioning of his forces was a masterclass in defensive warfare, stabilizing the line and setting the stage for the eventual Allied counter. but you rarely hear about that part of the story. The headlines went to Patton. Another key moment was the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. This was a stroke of incredible fortune. A bridge the Germans had failed to destroy, offering a direct path across the Rhine. When the report came in, some commanders might have hesitated, waiting for orders, for confirmation. Not Hodges. Recognizing the immense strategic opportunity, he immediately ordered every available unit to push across. "Shove everything you can across," he commanded. It was a decisive, bold move that likely shortened the war by weeks if not months. He didn't wait for a press conference. He seized the moment for victory. This was the essence of Courtney Hodges. He was a master of logistics, a brilliant tactician, and a leader who inspired deep devotion. Yet he never sought public adulation. He deflected praise, always redirecting it to the soldiers who fought and bled under his command. While Patton was collecting accolades and Montgomery was planning his press briefings, Hodges was quietly planning the next move, his focus solely on the mission and his men. He was a humble man from rural Georgia who found himself commanding one of the most powerful armies ever assembled, and he did so with quiet competence and an unshakable sense of duty. After the war, when the victory parades were over, Hodges slipped back into the quiet life he preferred. He didn't write a sensational memoir or embark on a lucrative speaking tour. He retired, content in the knowledge of a job well done. His satisfaction didn't come from newspaper headlines or public monuments. It came from something far more profound: the respect of the men who served under him, and the knowledge that their shared sacrifice had helped deliver freedom to millions. So as we remember the heroes of the Second World War, it's important to look past the familiar, dazzling names and into the shadows where figures like Courtney Hodges stand. He reminds us that true leadership isn't always loud. It isn't always glamorous. Sometimes the most effective and admirable leaders are the quiet ones, the steady hands who don't seek the spotlight, but simply focus on getting the job done. General Courtney Hodges was the silent victor, a true American hero whose legacy of quiet, decisive leadership deserves to be remembered and celebrated. His story is a powerful testament to the idea that true greatness is measured not in fame, but in duty, honor, and the lives you impact along the way. History often remembers the loud, charismatic leaders, the Patton, the Montgomery egos. But what about the quiet ones, the ones who didn't seek the spotlight, but simply sought victory for their men? Today, we're uncovering the story of a general you might not know, but whose legacy is written across the battlefields of Europe. Courtney Hicks Hodges, the ground truth general. His journey wasn't typical for a West Point graduate. In fact, he failed calculus and dropped out after his first year. Most would see this as the end of a military career. For Hodges, it was just the beginning. He enlisted as a private in 1906, determined to earn his commission the hard way. And he did. He climbed the ladder, not with bluster or connections, but with quiet competence and an unmatched understanding of the common soldier because he had been one. This experience forged his entire philosophy of leadership. He knew what it was like to be in the trenches, to follow orders, and to trust the men leading you. This unique path shaped him into a different kind of general. While other commanders planned from distant headquarters, poring over maps, Hodges needed to see the ground for himself. He needed the ground truth. He would often fly in a small Piper Cub plane, low over the front lines, observing the terrain, the enemy positions, and the reality his soldiers were facing. He trusted his eyes more than reports. This wasn't recklessness. It was a deep-seated need to connect his strategy with the lived experience of his troops. He believed that a plan made in an ivory tower was worthless if it didn't account for the mud, the hedgerows, and the fear in a soldier's heart. When the D-Day landings happened, Hodges was deputy commander of the First Army under General Omar Bradley. As the Allies pushed inland, they faced the treacherous Norman hedge, dense walls of earth and vegetation that turned the landscape into a deadly maze. Tanks were trapped, infantry was pinned down, and the advance stalled. It was a tactical nightmare. While others grew frustrated, Hodges, true to his nature, focused on the problem from the ground up. He listened to his men. He learned about a simple but brilliant innovation created by a sergeant named Curtis Cullentha: rhino modification. It involved welding steel tusks, made from German beach obstacles, onto the front of Sherman tanks. These rhinos could tear through the hedgerows, creating paths for the infantry to follow. Where another general might have dismissed a sergeant's idea, Hodges saw its genius. He championed it, ordering its widespread implementation. This wasn't just about a clever piece of engineering. It was about a command culture that valued ingenuity from any rank. Hodges understood that the best solutions often come from those closest to the problem. The Rhino tanks broke the stalemate, paving the way for Operation Cobra and the breakout from Normandy. It was a victory for ground truth, a testament to a leader who listened more than he talked. Soon after, Hodges was given command of the First Army, the largest single American field command in the war. He now led over 1 million men. Imagine the pressure. Yet, he remained the same unassuming, methodical leader. His command style was the polar opposite of his flamboyant counterpart, George Patton. Where Patton was all fire and fury, Hodges was calm and deliberate. He didn't give rousing speeches. Gave clear, concise orders. His headquarters was known for its quiet efficiency, a reflection of the man in charge. Some mistook his quietness for weakness or a lack of aggression. They were wrong. Hodges was relentless, a bulldog who, once he latched onto an objective, would not let go. His leadership was put to the ultimate test in the winter of 1944. During the Battle of the Bulge, the German Ardennes offensive struck a weak point in the Allied line, catching the First Army by surprise. In the initial chaos, Hodges' forces took the brunt of the attack. Communications were cut, units were surrounded, and panic began to set in. In this moment of crisis, Hodges remained unflappable. He refused to panic. While his northern flank was hammered, he expertly maneuvered his forces, holding the line at critical points like Elsenborn Ridge. He organized the defense of St. Vith, buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive. It was during the Bulge that one of his most famous, and perhaps most telling, quotes emerged. A subordinate, panicking about a German breakthrough, asked him what they should do. Hodges calmly replied, "We'll hold them." And they did. His steady hand prevented a catastrophic collapse. He never lost his nerve, and because he didn't, his men didn't either. He trusted them to hold, and they trusted him to lead them through the fire. He didn't command them from a safe distance. He was right there with them, managing the crises hour by hour. After the Bulge was contained, Hodges' First Army continued its relentless push into Germany. They were the first to cross the Rhine River, a monumental strategic and symbolic victory. It happened at the Ludendorff Bridge at Rheims. When Hodges learned that the bridge was unexpectedly still standing, he didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for a committee to approve the decision. He immediately ordered his troops to seize it. "Get me 5 divisions across," he commanded, understanding the golden opportunity before him. It was a calculated risk, a decisive move that shortened the war and saved countless lives. It was vintage Hodges. See the ground truth, adapt, and act decisively. From the Normandy beaches to the heart of Germany, General Courtney Hodges led the First Army without losing a single major battle. It's an incredible record, yet he remains one of the least celebrated high commanders of the war. Why? Because he didn't fit the mold? He wasn't a charismatic showman. He was a quiet professional, a master of logistics and tactics, a leader who put his men first. He embodied a different kind of greatness, one built on empathy, adaptability, and an unwavering trust in the soldiers on the ground. Hodges once said, "You don't command soldiers, you walk with them until they stop needing commands." This perfectly encapsulates his philosophy. He saw leadership not as an exercise of authority, but as a shared journey. From his humble beginnings as a private who flunked out of West Point, he walked that journey alongside his men, all the way to victory in Europe. He proved that true leadership isn't about being seen, it's about seeing the terrain, seeing the opportunity, and most importantly, seeing the humanity and potential in every soldier under your command. The legacy of the ground truth general is a powerful reminder that sometimes the quietest voices have the most profound impact.